The dust from the cattle drive settled on the horizon as Katherine Morgan stared out across the open prairie, wondering how she'd ended up so far from Boston in this desolate frontier town of Sweetwater, Wyoming Territory, 1875. The relentless summer sun beat down on her shoulders as she adjusted her bonnet and straightened her spine with the proper posture her finishing school had drilled into her. Only 23 years old, and already she felt like her life had derailed completely from the careful track her parents had laid out for her. "Miss Morgan," the livery owner called out, interrupting her thoughts, "your wagon's ready to take you to your uncle's homestead." Katherine nodded stiffly, gripping her small leather satchel tighter. Uncle Thomas had written after her parents' passing, offering her a home at his ranch 15 miles outside of town. With no other options and their family fortune squandered by her father's poor investments, she had little choice but to accept. "Thank you," she replied, her voice carrying the refined accent of the East Coast that immediately marked her as an outsider. The wagon driver, a weathered old man named Jasper, helped her climb aboard. "It'll be rough terrain, miss. Hold tight." As they pulled away from the dusty Main Street, Katherine caught sight of a commotion outside the saloon. A tall man with broad shoulders stood facing three others, his stance calm but alert. Even from a distance, she could see his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. "Who is that?" she asked Jasper, nodding toward the standoff. Jasper squinted. "That there's Preston Hayes." "Best to keep your distance from that one, miss. Man's got a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" Katherine asked, unable to tear her eyes away as Preston Hayes stared down the three men who eventually backed away, disappearing into the saloon. "The kind that follows a man who's good with a gun," Jasper replied cryptically. "Your uncle mentioned he hired a new ranch foreman recently. Might be him." Katherine felt a flutter of unease. The last thing she needed was to share a homestead with some gunslinging cowboy. She'd had enough unpredictability in her life. As the wagon pulled away from town, she didn't notice the tall cowboy watching her departure. His eyes narrowed against the sun, a curious expression on his face. 3 days later, Katherine had settled into the modest but comfortable ranch house. Uncle Thomas was kind but distant, clearly unused to female company since her aunt's passing 5 years prior. The house needed a woman's touch, and Katherine found herself grateful for the distraction of cleaning and organizing. She was hanging linens on the clothesline when hoofbeats approached. Looking up, she saw a rider coming toward the house, the same man she'd glimpsed in town. Up close, Preston Hayes was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a winter sky. A week's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and his dark hair curled slightly where it escaped from beneath his hat. He tipped his hat to her. "Miss Morgan, I presume?" "Mr. Hayes," she replied coolly, refusing to be intimidated. A hint of surprise crossed his features. "Thomas mentioned you'd be arriving. Welcome to Wyoming Territory." "Thank you," she said, turning back to her laundry. "My uncle mentioned you're new to the ranch as well." Preston dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Been here 3 months." "Your uncle needed help after losing some men to the railroad." Katherine nodded, not sure what else to say to this man who seemed to fill the space around him with his presence. "Thomas asked me to let you know he'll be late returning tonight. Cattle broke through the north fence line." "I appreciate the message," she replied formally. Preston studied her for a moment, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're not what I expected." Katherine raised an eyebrow. "And what did you expect, Mr. Hayes?" "Not someone who looks like she'd be more at home at a fancy Boston tea party than a Wyoming ranch." Katherine bristled. "Appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Hayes. I'm perfectly capable of adapting to my circumstances." "Never said you weren't," he replied easily. "Just making an observation." Before Katherine could respond, he tipped his hat again, remounted his horse, and rode toward the bunkhouse, leaving her feeling oddly flustered. Over the next few weeks, Katherine fell into the rhythm of ranch life. She rose early, prepared meals, tended the garden, and slowly transformed the neglected house into a home. She occasionally caught glimpses of Preston as he worked with the other ranch hands, leading cattle drives, mending fences, and training horses. Despite her initial wariness, she found herself watching him when he wasn't looking. There was something compelling about the way he moved, confident but not arrogant, powerful yet controlled. The other men looked to him with respect, and even her gruff uncle seemed to value his opinion. One evening, as she was returning from gathering eggs, she heard piano music drifting from the bunkhouse. Curious, she followed the sound and peered through the open door. Preston sat at an old upright piano, his fingers moving skillfully across the keys, playing a melody that tugged at something deep inside her. She must have made a sound because he suddenly looked up, his fingers stilling on the keys. "Miss Morgan," he said, rising to his feet. "Didn't see you there." "I'm sorry for intruding," she said quickly. "I heard the music and—" "No intrusion," he replied. "My mother taught me to play, said every man should know more than just how to shoot and ride." Katherine stepped hesitantly into the bunkhouse. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," he said simply, and Katherine understood the past tense all too well. "Would you play something else?" she asked impulsively. He studied her for a moment, then nodded and sat back down. His fingers found the keys again, and a sweet, melancholy tune filled the room. Katherine closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. When the last note faded, she opened her eyes to find him watching her. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "Music's one of the few beautiful things out here," he replied. "Makes the hardship worth it." They stood in silence for a moment, something unspoken passing between them before Katherine remembered herself. "I should get back to the house," she said. "Uncle Thomas will be waiting for supper." Preston nodded. "Good night, Miss Morgan." "Katherine," she said suddenly. "You can call me Katherine." A slow smile spread across his face. "Katherine," he repeated as if testing the sound of it. "Good night then, Katherine. Good night." "Preston," she replied, her heart beating oddly fast as she hurried back to the house. The summer days stretched long and hot as July turned to August. Katherine found herself increasingly aware of Preston's presence on the ranch. They'd exchange glances across the yard, brief conversations when their paths crossed. There was something building between them, a tension, an awareness that both excited and frightened her. One afternoon, as she was picking vegetables in the garden, a shadow fell across her. Looking up, she found Preston standing there, hat in hand. "Your uncle asked me to escort you to town tomorrow," he said. "He's ordered supplies and he thought you might want to pick up some things for yourself." Katherine straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "That would be nice, thank you." Preston shifted slightly. "There's a social at the town hall tomorrow night, dancing and such. We could stay for it if you'd like." Katherine felt a flutter in her stomach. "I didn't bring any suitable clothes for a dance." "You look suitable enough to me," he said, his eyes holding hers for a beat too long before he looked away. "Just thought you might enjoy meeting some folks from town." Katherine hesitated. The truth was, she didn't want to dance with folks from town. The only person she could imagine dancing with was standing right in front of her, and that realization unsettled her deeply. "I don't dance," she said finally, the lie slipping easily from her lips. In truth, she'd spent years learning the proper ways to waltz and quadrille at finishing school, but the thought of being held in Preston's arms made her feel things she wasn't ready to examine. Something like disappointment flickered across his face before his expression became unreadable again. "Fair enough, we'll just go for the supplies then." He nodded and turned to leave, but Katherine called after him. "Preston," he looked back. "What time should I be ready?" "First light," he said. "It's a long ride." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Katherine dressed carefully in her most practical riding skirt and a crisp white blouse, pinning her hair up neatly beneath her bonnet. When she stepped outside, Preston was waiting with the wagon, already loaded with empty crates for the supplies. "Morning," he said, offering his hand to help her up. "Good morning," she replied, trying to ignore the warmth that spread from where their hands touched. The journey to town took several hours, during which they fell into surprisingly easy conversation. Preston told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, losing his parents to typhoid fever when he was 16, and making his way west to find work. Katherine shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her education, and reluctantly, the financial ruin that had sent her to Wyoming. "So you never planned to come west?" Preston asked as they crossed a shallow creek. Katherine shook her head. "I was supposed to marry a banker's son, host dinner parties, and raise proper Boston children. And now—" She looked out across the vast landscape, the distant mountains purple against the sky. "Now I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. Everything I was trained for is useless here." "Not everything," Preston said. "You've brought life back to Thomas's house. Man's changed since you arrived." "Smiles more," Katherine glanced at him. "You notice such things?" "I notice a lot of things," he replied, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the trail ahead. In town, they spent several hours collecting supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, fabric, tools, and mail that had accumulated at the general store. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Billings, took an immediate liking to Katherine, insisting she stay for tea while Preston handled the loading of heavier supplies. "So you're Thomas Morgan's niece," Mrs. Billings said, pouring tea into delicate cups that seemed out of place in the frontier store. "And I see you've got Preston Hayes escorting you today," Katherine nodded, wondering at the woman's tone. "Interesting man, that one," Mrs. Billings continued. "Arrived in Sweetwater about 6 months ago, quiet, keeps to himself, but fair and hardworking by all accounts." "Yes, my uncle speaks highly of him," Katherine replied. Mrs. Billings leaned forward. "There are stories, of course. They say he was a lawman back in Colorado before coming here. Others say he rode with a rough crowd for a while. Hard to know the truth with men like that." Katherine sipped her tea, uncomfortable with the gossip but undeniably curious. "Men like what?" "Men with shadows in their eyes," Mrs. Billings said meaningfully. "The kind who have seen things, done things. Not that he's ever caused trouble here, quite the opposite. Stopped the Henderson boys from tearing up the saloon last month without even drawing his gun." Before Katherine could respond, the bell above the door jingled and Preston entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. "Wagons loaded, Katherine," he said. "Ready when you are, Mrs." Billings gave Katherine a knowing look that made her cheeks warm. "Thank you for the tea," Katherine said, rising quickly. Outside, the afternoon sun was slipping toward the horizon. Preston helped her into the wagon. "We should head back," he said, "unless you'd like to stay for the social." Katherine hesitated, thinking of Mrs. Billings' words. What had Preston seen and done before coming to Sweetwater? Did it matter? "The supplies will keep," he added, misinterpreting her silence. "And your uncle won't expect us back until tomorrow anyway." "You want to stay," she realized. He shrugged. "Been a while since I've heard proper music. Might be nice." Katherine looked toward the town hall where lanterns were already being lit and a fiddle was being tuned. She thought of the crowded room, the music, the possibility of standing close to Preston in a way that daily ranch life didn't allow. "We can stay," she said finally. "But I meant what I said. I don't dance." Preston's face brightened with a rare, full smile that transformed his features. "Then we'll just watch." They secured the wagon and made their way to the town hall, which had been transformed with bunting and lanterns for the occasion. Inside, tables lined the walls with punch and simple refreshments, while the center of the room had been cleared for dancing. A small group of musicians was playing a lively tune, and several couples were already moving across the floor. Katherine felt conspicuous in her practical clothes among women in their best dresses, but Preston guided her to a quiet corner with a steady hand at the small of her back. "Punch?" he asked. She nodded, watching him walk away. His confident stride and straight shoulders drew glances from several women, and Katherine felt an unexpected pang of jealousy. "You're Thomas Morgan's niece, aren't you?" a voice asked. Katherine turned to see a young woman about her age, prettily dressed in blue calico. "Yes, I'm Katherine Morgan, Lily Barnes," the woman replied with a friendly smile. "My father owns the mercantile next to the bank. I heard you arrived from Boston. It must be quite an adjustment." "It has been," Katherine admitted, "but not entirely unwelcome." Lily glanced past her. "And I see you came with Preston Hayes. Half the girls in town will be green with envy." Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Hayes works for my uncle. He merely escorted me to town for supplies." Lily raised an eyebrow. "If you say so. But a word of advice: if he asks you to dance, say yes. Man moves like poetry from what I hear, though he rarely dances with anyone." Before Katherine could respond, Preston returned with 2 cups of punch. He nodded politely to Lily, who excused herself with a knowing smile that made Katherine want to sink through the floorboards. "Friend of yours?" Preston asked, handing her a cup. "We just met," Katherine replied. "She seems nice." They stood side by side watching the dancers. The music shifted to a slower waltz and couples moved together across the floor. Katherine felt Preston's eyes on her. "Sure you don't want to dance?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him, at the question in his blue eyes, and something inside her wavered. "I told you I don't dance." "And I don't believe you," he said, a hint of challenge in his voice. "Your posture changes when the music plays. Your foot taps in time. You've had lessons." Katherine looked away. "That was another life." Preston set down his cup and held out his hand. "One dance, Katherine. Then we'll leave if you want." Her heart raced as she looked at his outstretched hand. What was she afraid of? That she'd enjoy being in his arms too much? That the careful walls she'd built around her heart would crumble? "I don't dance," she repeated, her voice barely audible over the music. Preston studied her for a long moment, then surprised her by nodding acceptance. "Then we'll just stand here together," he said simply, moving to stand beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers as they watched the dancers. The simple declaration, the way he respected her refusal while still remaining beside her, touched something deep inside Katherine. Any other man might have pressed her, might have taken offense or walked away to find a more willing partner. But Preston simply stood with her, accepting her choice while offering his presence. They remained that way through 3 more dances, not speaking, simply standing together in comfortable silence. Katherine was acutely aware of him, the clean scent of soap and leather, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his fingers occasionally brushed against hers, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not. When the music paused and the dancers dispersed for refreshments, Preston turned to her. "Ready to head back to the ranch?" Katherine nodded, suddenly eager to be away from the crowded room, away from curious eyes. Outside, the night air was cool and clear. Stars spread across the vast Wyoming sky in a dazzling display Katherine still wasn't used to after the hazy skies of Boston. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Preston said, following her gaze upward. "Yes," she agreed. "I never saw stars like this back east." "One of the reasons I stay out west," he said. "That and the space to breathe." They walked toward the wagon, but instead of climbing up, Preston hesitated. "It's late," he said. "Might be safer to stay in town tonight and head back at first light. There's a decent hotel just down the street." Katherine considered the long, dark ride back to the ranch and nodded. That seems sensible. The hotel was small but clean, with a no-nonsense proprietress who gave Katherine a room of her own while Preston took one across the hall. After bidding him good night, Katherine closed her door and leaned against it, her heart racing with emotions she couldn't quite name. Sleep eluded her as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, her mind filled with images of Preston, the way he'd looked at her when he asked her to dance, the solid presence of him beside her, the respectful distance he maintained despite the obvious tension between them. What was it about this quiet, mysterious cowboy that unsettled her so? And what would happen if she stopped fighting whatever was growing between them? Morning came too quickly. After a simple breakfast in the hotel dining room, they loaded the last of their supplies and set out for the ranch. The return journey was quieter, both of them lost in their thoughts. As they crested a hill overlooking the valley where her uncle's ranch sprawled, Preston pulled the wagon to a stop. Something wrong? Katherine asked. He shook his head. Just wanted to show you something. He pointed to where a herd of wild horses moved across the valley floor, their manes flying as they ran in perfect formation. I've never seen anything like that, Katherine breathed, watching the magnificent animals. Freedom, Preston said simply. That's what the West offers that the East never could, room to run, to be who you really are without so many rules boxing you in. Katherine looked at him. Is that why you came West, for freedom? A shadow crossed his face. Partly, also to outrun some things. What things? She asked softly. Preston was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Mistakes, he finally said. Regrets, things I can't change. Mrs. Billings mentioned you might have been a lawman once, he nodded. Marshal in a small Colorado town for 3 years, thought I could make a difference. What happened? Preston's jaw tightened. Failed when it mattered most. A family died because I trusted the wrong man. After that, I couldn't wear the badge anymore. I'm sorry, Katherine said, understanding now some of the shadows in his eyes. It's in the past, he replied. But it's why I keep to myself, why I don't. He trailed off. Why you don't what? He looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes intense. Why I don't let myself get close to people. Until now, Katherine's breath caught. Preston, you don't have to say anything, he said quickly. I'm not asking for anything. Just wanted you to know where things stand with me. Before she could respond, he flicked the reins, and the wagon continued down the hill toward the ranch. That evening, Katherine prepared supper while Uncle Thomas and Preston discussed ranch business at the kitchen table. She moved around the kitchen aware of Preston's occasional glances, of the weight of what remained unspoken between them. After supper, Preston excused himself to check on a mare about to foal, and Thomas retired to his study with his pipe, leaving Katherine alone with her thoughts. Unable to settle, she stepped outside onto the porch, breathing in the night air. The sound of piano music drifted from the bunkhouse again. Without thinking, she followed it, drawn to the melody and the man playing it. Preston looked up as she entered, his fingers stilling on the keys. Don't stop, she said. He studied her for a moment, then resumed playing, a hauntingly beautiful piece she didn't recognize. Katherine moved closer, watching his hands move across the keys with surprising grace for a man who spent his days roping cattle and breaking horses. When the piece ended, he remained seated, looking up at her with a question in his eyes. What was that? She asked. Something I wrote, he admitted. It doesn't have a name, it should, she said. It's beautiful. Katherine, he said, her name sounding different somehow when he said it. About what I said earlier, did you mean it? She interrupted. He stood, closing the distance between them. Every word. Katherine took a deep breath. I've been running too, in my own way. Running from the fact that everything I was raised to be, everything I was supposed to want, never felt right. Coming west was forced on me, but now I can't imagine going back. What do you want, Katherine? Preston asked quietly. She looked up at him, at the face that had become so dear to her in such a short time. I want to stop running. I want to find out what it means to be free, as you said, to be who I really am. Preston reached out slowly, giving her time to step away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. And who is that? I'm not sure yet, she admitted. But I'd like to find out with you. Something changed in his expression, hope replacing caution. I'd like that too. They stood close, neither moving, the moment suspended between them until Katherine made a decision. She leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. Preston responded with restraint at first, then with growing intensity as she moved closer, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, he rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you hanging laundry and looking at me like I was some kind of outlaw, he confessed. Katherine laughed softly. I thought you were dangerous. I am, he said, his expression growing serious. My past, there are things you should know before this goes any further. Tell me, she said, no more secrets. They sat on the bench by the piano, and Preston told her everything about his time as a marshal. about trusting a deputy who turned out to be working with a gang of outlaws, about the family of settlers who died in a raid he should have prevented. He told her about tracking down the men responsible afterward, about the violence that still haunted his dreams. After it was over, I couldn't wear the badge anymore, he said. Drifted for a while, took odd jobs. Your uncle gave me a chance when most wouldn't. Katherine took his hand, noticing for the first time the scars that marked his knuckles. You did what you thought was right. It wasn't enough, he said. That's what I live with. Is that why you came to Sweetwater, to hide? He nodded. Partly. Also to start fresh where no one knew me. And then you arrived and complicated everything. Me? Katherine asked. How did I complicate things? Preston smiled faintly. By making me want things I'd given up on, a real life, maybe even a future. Katherine's heart swelled at his words. I want those things too, he squeezed her hand. It won't be easy, people will talk. Your Uncle Thomas likes you, she interrupted. And as for people talking, let them. I've spent my whole life worrying about what others think. I'm done with that. Preston's smile widened. There's that freedom I mentioned. Katherine leaned against him, feeling a sense of rightness she'd never experienced before. Play something else, she requested. He turned back to the piano but kept one hand holding hers as he played a simple, sweet melody with the other. As September arrived, the days grew shorter and the nights cooler. Katherine and Preston's relationship deepened, though they were careful to be discreet around the ranch. Uncle Thomas, however, was more observant than they gave him credit for. One evening, as Katherine cleared the supper dishes, Thomas cleared his throat. Planning to tell me about you and Hayes, or were you hoping I'd go blind in my old age? Katherine froze, a plate in her hand. Uncle Thomas, he waved her explanation away. Don't need the details. Just want to know if his intentions are honorable. Yes, she said firmly. They are, Thomas nodded. Good. He's a fine man, despite whatever he's running from. Lord knows we've all got something in our past we'd rather forget. Katherine set the plate down and hugged her uncle impulsively. Thank you. Thomas patted her back awkwardly. Just be sure he treats you right, or he'll answer to me. Later, when she told Preston about the conversation, he laughed. Your uncle threatened to shoot me 2 weeks ago if I didn't make an honest woman of you soon. Said he wasn't born yesterday and could see what was happening. Katherine's eyes widened. He did not. He most certainly did, Preston assured her. Right after telling me I'd better have saved some money if I was planning on setting up a household. And what did you say? Katherine asked, her heart beating faster. Preston took her hand. I said I had a stake saved up and was just waiting to make sure you were ready for such a discussion. And am I? She asked softly. Ready, I mean, he studied her face. That's what I'm asking, Katherine. I'm not a wealthy man and ranch work is hard, but I love you and I want to build a life with you if you'll have me. Tears welled in Katherine's eyes. Are you proposing Preston Hayes? Doing a poor job of it, apparently, he said with a rueful smile, then dropped to one knee before her. Katherine Morgan, I've loved you since you stood in that yard and told me you didn't dance. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she whispered, pulling him to his feet and into her arms. Yes, I will. They were married in early October in a small ceremony at the town church. Mrs. Billings insisted on hosting a reception at the town hall afterward, complete with music and dancing. When the fiddle struck up a waltz, Preston turned to Katherine with a raised eyebrow. Mrs. Hayes, he said, offering his hand. May I have this dance? Katherine hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. I thought you knew, she said with a mischievous smile. I don't dance. Preston pulled her gently into his arms. Then we'll just stand here together, he whispered against her ear. But as the music swelled around them, Katherine found herself moving with him, following his lead as they glided across the floor. I thought you didn't dance, he teased, spinning her gracefully. I changed my mind, she replied, laughing. I'm allowed to do that now. It's part of that freedom you mentioned. Preston pulled her closer. I love you, Katherine Hayes. And I love you, she replied. realizing as they danced beneath the lantern light that she'd found something she never expected in this wild, untamed land. Not just love, but a home, a purpose, and the freedom to be herself at last. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow by mid-November. Katherine and Preston had moved into a small cabin on the property that Uncle Thomas had helped them renovate. It was simple but cozy, with a stone fireplace that kept the bitter Wyoming cold at bay. On a particularly snowy evening, as they sat before the fire, Preston working on mending a bridle while Katherine quilted, he looked up suddenly. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Leaving Boston, all the fine things you had there," Katherine set her quilting aside. "Not for a moment. Everything there was just surface. Beautiful perhaps, but empty. Here, everything is real, the hardships and the joys." Preston nodded, setting his work aside and moving to sit beside her. "Spring's coming. I've been thinking." "About what?" she asked, leaning against him. "Thomas offered to sell us the north section of the ranch, said it's good land, enough to start our own place if we wanted." Katherine looked up at him. "Our own ranch? It wouldn't be easy," he cautioned. "We'd start small. Few cattle, couple of horses, build from there." "I think it sounds perfect," she said, kissing him softly. Preston smiled against her lips. "There's something else," he said, pulling back to look at her. "Thomas mentioned that the town's looking for a new sheriff, asked if I'd consider it." Katherine stilled. "And would you?" "After everything that happened in Colorado?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me thinks I've no right to wear a badge again, but another part thinks maybe it's a chance to make things right in a way." "What do you want to do?" she asked. Preston was quiet for a moment. "I want to build our ranch, our future, but I also want to be the kind of man who stands up when he's needed. The town's growing. They need someone who knows the law." Katherine took his hand, running her thumb over the scars on his knuckles. "Then do both. Be the man I know you are, the one who stands for what's right, who builds rather than destroys. I'll be with you, whatever you decide." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," she replied, "finding each other in this vast wilderness." Spring arrived with new beginnings. Katherine and Preston began work on their own homestead, while Preston took on the role of sheriff 2 days a week, enough to maintain order in the growing town without taking too much time from their ranch. On a warm May afternoon, as they stood on the rise overlooking the land that was now theirs, Katherine turned to Preston with a smile. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. "Come November, we'll have one more resident on our ranch." Preston's eyes widened, then filled with joy as understanding dawned. He lifted her in his arms, spinning her around as she laughed. "A baby," he said in wonder when he set her down. "Our baby." "Our baby," she confirmed, her heart full as she looked at the man who had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined when she'd first arrived in Wyoming. That night, as moonlight spilled through the window of their cabin, Preston held her close, his hand resting protectively over the new life growing within her. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" she asked sleepily. "For not dancing with me that night," he said. "For standing with me instead, for showing me what really matters." Katherine smiled in the darkness. "I'll always stand with you, Preston Hayes, until the end of our days." And as they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, she knew it was a promise they would both keep through all the joys and hardships that lay ahead. Through all the seasons of their lives together in this wild, beautiful land they now called home. Years passed, and the small homestead grew into a prosperous ranch. Katherine and Preston welcomed 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter who grew strong and free in the Wyoming wilderness. Preston continued to serve as sheriff part-time, earning the respect of the community while building their ranch into one of the finest in the territory. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as they stood together on the porch of the large house that had replaced their modest cabin, Preston wrapped his arms around Katherine from behind. "Any regrets, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, resting his chin on her shoulder. Katherine turned in his arms, noting the silver now threading through his dark hair, the laugh lines around his eyes that matched her own. "Only that we didn't meet sooner," she replied. From inside the house came the sound of their youngest son playing the piano, the same upright from the bunkhouse that had witnessed the beginning of their love story all those years ago. Preston smiled, extending his hand. "May I have this dance?" Katherine placed her hand in his. "I thought you knew," she said with a smile that hadn't dimmed with the passing years. "I don't dance." Preston pulled her close, swaying gently to the music drifting through the open window. "Then we'll just stand here together," he whispered, echoing the words that had marked the beginning of their journey. "Forever," Katherine agreed, resting her head against his chest, knowing that in his arms she had found everything she never knew. She was looking for a love that had transformed her from a lost Boston lady into a woman who had helped build something lasting in this wild frontier. As the sun set over the land they had tamed together, they continued their dance, the dance of two people who had found in each other not just love, but home.